Can we talk about Pokrovsk? It seems like it is under a huge amount of pressure. And you have some Ukrainian channels now that are like, oh, Pokrovsk is not a big deal. Oh, it's not a big deal. It's not a hub of anything. It's, no big deal. And you and I were talking about Slavyansk, Kramatorsk for the last 3 years, that is this kind of hard shell part of Ukrainian military, but the Russians seem to be getting closer and closer to that location. What is going on in the battlefield west?
Okay, so we're talking two different places in the Donbass region, right? Pokrovsk is pretty much the last holdout in what you would call South Central Donbass. It was previously a logistics hub because multiple roads and highways meet there. It has long since ceased being so, right? It is no longer serving that purpose because it has been under siege, slowly tightening siege for several months now. The city now it's a small city, or it was, right, prior to the last few months, is increasingly it's in an operational encirclement. I think that is generally agreed to even by the Kiev regime's pro-Kiev regime military analysts at this point. All of its supply lines are either physically cut off or firmly under Russian drone and artillery control at this point. And on top of that, Russia is there's heavy fighting, essentially in the absolute worst part, right on the north side, right? Russia's moving all the way around the city and to the north side, and there's a small town by the name of Rudenko, something of the sort, that is being very heavily fought over right now. But if, and I would say when, the Russian forces get control of that, well, then it's physical encirclement for all intents and purposes. That's the death knell. And Russia's already going for the jugular there. Again, they're not taking defenses head on, right? Because they don't needlessly waste their troops, right? They're going the months-long siege to, take the place to minimize their own troops' casualties. Now, what is happening in Pokrovsk is essentially now part of more or less the same operation as the tightening of a similar encirclement around Konstantinovka, a little bit to the north, well, quite a small distance to the northeast, if you take the total of the Donbass region. Now, Konstantinovka is the tail end, the southern end of this last Kiev regime defensive line in the Donbass that we have been talking about. Well, yeah, you're right, for 3 years now. That is Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka. And there's Russia is mopping up the last suburb in Chasiv Yar, west of Bakhmut right now. And Chasiv Yar is a fight that has been going on for more than a year now. And it was a long, bitter fight. And Russia, for their military sequencing and timing, seem to prioritize other areas at different times because timing is very important for the Russian military's plans. It's fluid, but it's also important. And it just seemed that mopping up Chasiv Yar became a months-long process that was not prioritized due to timing more than anything else. Well, now it's being timed up. And the important thing is if you look at a topographical map, you will see that the Chasiv Yar area is on a heightened elevation that then is going to look down on the valley of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka line, right from the east, at the same time that Russian forces are moving up on that line from the southeast and the south, from the Pokrovsk area. So it's all kind of coming and tightening together slowly. Again, you hear these comments from the Western media. Oh, the Russian offensive is, faltering. It's losing steam, blah, blah, blah. It's grinding to a halt. You people have no idea what you're talking about. And the boa constrictor is tightening and tightening and tightening. And the boa constrictor, we can all sympathize with the mouse or the hare, whatever. And we can say, oh, Jesus, just put it out of its misery already. But the boa constrictor will take its time, right? Whatever we may think about it. And that's what's happening right now in the Pokrovsk and the Konstantinovka. And then you can go further and say the same things up to the last remnants of Chasiv Yar, and even further up to the very top of the theater, what's going on now in Seversk at the very last holdout in the north of the theater as well. But it's all, as a Pentagon official described it now more than a month ago, it is like a lava flow, right? The Russian offensive. It cannot be stopped. It is inexorable, and it is inevitable.
Well, Bogdanov, who's making the argument that this can only go for another year, what does it mean? Because you're right. When he made the point, he said something like, it's easy. And it's like, dude, what are you talking about? Like, it made no sense. And if he's arguing, well, this can only go a year, he's making an assessment based on what he's seeing.
That being said, I don't think he's actually a very good military intelligence chief, to be perfectly honest. He was elevated up right after the CIA brags in the pages of the New York Times, right, that they took over the Kiev regime's intelligence, rebuilt them in their own image, right? They're quite clear about that. They brag about it. They're so happy about it. And that Budanov, who was in covert operations, was elevated to this role effectively by the United States. He's their man there. And he seems to have a certain type of malicious cunning, right, for covert operations, right? Assassinations, behind the lines stuff. But I don't know if that's really what you want your military intelligence chief to be, because your military intelligence chief's primary job should be understanding and managing all the data coming in on the conflict to provide that to your own military. I think he's a lot better at the covert operations, malicious stuff than he is at any real traditional military intelligence chief role.
You still think they can keep going for several years?
Zelensky has, put out plans already. I mean, this was already out weeks ago that they expect the conflict to continue until 2029.
He's out of his mind. I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. 4 years? They think this can go on for another 4 years?
I also do not think that without Western troops, this can go on for another 4 years. But I think it could easily go on for another year or two, unless we see something dramatic change on the battlefield in the next few months.
A miracle of the Vistula. This immaculate conception.
At the end of the day, I will point out that the Kiev regime, the military is being treated, right? The manpower woes are severe. That Western military supplies are dwindling, both in terms of what they can provide and how much they can provide. But the Kiev regime is military, those 200,000 plus desertions aside, are still fighting. They're still, I'm always amazed that they're able to, one way or another, get large numbers of men to fight and women too, increasingly, to fight and die for this regime, right? I don't expect anything different from the Banderites, but even the Banderites numbers aren't really more than 100,000, all total. And the fact that they keep fighting is a continual source of, shall we say, the cold water of reality hitting that of this type of near peer conflict is hard. It's bitter, it's bloody, and even when Russia has all the advantages, they still are capable of suffering local temporary setbacks, right? And that the Kiev regime continues to fight. And if it wasn't for the nature of what they're fighting for, you would almost say stubbornly and admirably to a significant degree. I would not use those words because that's not the way I feel about the Banderite regime in Kiev. but it's still a tragedy for all the Ukrainian men whom do not have those ideological Banderite convictions and are still fighting and dying for this regime, to this day. That's I still think they'll be able to. Ukraine is big. The Ukrainian military is getting smaller and less effective. There's no question about that. But Ukraine is big. And, I know the Western media likes, the talking points like running in and talking about, oh, Russia's only managed to take this percentage of Ukraine after 3 years of war, which completely shows they have no understanding about the war of attrition that is occurring, and that once the Kiev regime military has deteriorated to a certain point, then Russia puts their 2 strategic reserve armies in, and things start moving much more dramatically and rapidly, at some point, and then they'll find some way to justify how wrong they've been for several years now. But the end point of that is that Ukraine is big, and Russia might be forced to militarily take and occupy most of it. So when I say that this war could continue on for a long time, that has more to do with the fact of the size of Ukraine than it is of, the slugfest continuing for another 2 years on the battlefield to the same degree it is today. Then you have guerrilla war. The guerrilla war comes after.
Which is what Europe wants. Do you buy, and this could be the last question, this idea of Europe using Ukraine as a platform to attack Russia? I mean, they're saying this coalition of the willing. Personally, I don't know if I buy this. I think this is more to do with any notion of negotiations failing, that Russia can't believe in negotiations, in which case they have to keep going. But they are putting this chum in the water of saying the UK, Germany are maybe stupid enough to do it. Those guys look like Nazis, especially
Mertz is a piece of work.
Yes, but do you think that they're legit in thinking that they're planning this in earnest?
Yeah, they have a degree of sincerity in it, no matter how unrealistic in military terms it is, because of the level of deterioration of the European military to this point. But there's I believe that there's 2 different things simultaneously. They aren't that everything. Whenever you make a political decision for a military or any other, even of just a political action, you usually have more than one reason you're doing it. People like to say, oh, it's because of this, and to bring it down to one thing. So on one hand, by continually talking about putting European troops on the ground, as soon as there is a ceasefire, you make sure there will never be a ceasefire. That is, I believe, the immediate and political need here. I also believe that at some point, the Europeans are going to have, and the Americans are going to have increased desperation and pressure to put some type of human tripwire force on the ground when Russia is moving for Kiev or Odessa, right? Crossing the Dnieper in force and these other things. Because we're seeing this hysteria now when Russia is moving on Pokrovsk in the Donbass. Can you imagine what the insanity of the Russophobic hysteria is going to be when Russian forces are moving on Kiev? Right? Yeah. We can't even imagine that at this point. But in that regard, I think that the European elite, the leaders of particularly Germany, France, and the UK, which is what it is to a large extent. You could also throw in Netherlands and Belgium and Norway and some other little inconsequentials, the Baltics, if you feel the need. But with all due respect to the hyenas, which are a species that I have a degree of fascination, this is like a pack of hyenas working themselves up to attacking a lion or a pride of lions, right? They're goading each other, they're laughing, they're surging forward, they're backing up, they're circling around, right? And at the end of the day, they may not eventually do anything. But right now in their minds, they're certainly thinking that they could do it at one point. And at some point, if the lion shows weakness or one hyena gets suicidally more stupid than the others, then they may all surge forward at some point, right? But that's why I say that there is a degree of sincerity, and that degree will increase at some point in the future as Russia's territorial movements in Ukraine become more faster and more significant. And that point is not very far away, right? I mean, that's within a year. So there is still the possibility for it. And anything can happen. Black swan events could happen, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the U.S. politically. Donald Trump is completely unreliable. I mean, I remember at one point almost being convinced when Donald Trump said Zelensky was a dictator. And I'm like, well, you can't just take that back. I mean, he said it. And the next week, he took it back. And I'm like, oh, you almost got me. Like, I almost bought into Trump for a second, right? I didn't, but I'm like, I was suddenly paying attention to a degree that I never had been, to Trump before. And I'm like, you can't just take back the U.S. president calling him a dictator. And the next week it was, did I say that? It doesn't sound like something I'd say. And everyone pretended. The media, everyone pretended that he hadn't said it, right? So Trump, he is a chaos bomb. He is eminently 100% unpredictable. I mean, at points, right? At some points, it becomes almost predictable what he would do.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Particularly with his puerile tantrum, his childlike tantrums and so forth. But at other times, he'll just come with an about face that makes no logical sense whatsoever because he's not operating from a position of logic. I mean, at least not logic the way the rest of the world understands it.
We will be here to cover it. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. And you can check his channel out on Real Politic with Mark Sleboda on Boosty, Boosty. If you just put in his name, he has videos, articles, anything that he does in regards to videos and whatnot comes out on that show, on that channel. So definitely check him out.
Lots of exclusive content 3 times a week.
Check him out. Mark, thank you for this, man. I really appreciate it. You be safe, okay?
You as well.
All right. We have